believe. So Andrea Dworkin, many women will have heard of her, and many women will have read some of her books, perhaps not this one. Her books are in some ways easy to read and in some ways very difficult to read. They're easy to read because she's very clear. I mean, there's no complicated, Judith Butler type or, even like, sane philosopher kind of writing. It's very, very, very clear. It's difficult to read because she is, oh my God, she pulls no punches. I mean, it's relentless. She will talk about things very, very realistically. And she, as the saying used to go, tells it like it is. This book, Scapegoat, the subtitle is The Jews, Israel, and Women's Liberation. That may seem an odd thing, but think about what we see now online, memes saying things like, everyone I don't like is Hitler or the Nazis, or, everyone who disagrees with me is Hitler or the Nazis. The social media axiom that in a debate or a discussion, an argument, the first one to accuse the opponent of being like Hitler or the Nazis is the loser or loses credibility. But there really are people whose mindset, values, and tactics towards women are analogous to those of Hitler and the Nazis towards Jews. And that's not just true. That wasn't just true during World War II and the immediately preceding time, but it was true for eons before that, or a very long time before that, and it's true now. When we think of Hitler and the Nazis, we think about the end stage, 1945, the 1940s during World War II, with the concentration camps. But don't just look at things the way they wind up. Look at how they started. Before that, there was, if you know the history, it was Kristallnacht, 1938. Before that, there were the Nuremberg laws in 1935. The brown shirts were very, very active from the late 20s, early 1930s, but they were founded in 1921. So it didn't start with the concentration camps. It started with guys in brown shirts terrorizing people, not allowing people to speak freely, being in the streets, trying to terrorize people who would have any kind of meetings or public public displays of any opposition to practically anything. So the horrors of the camps were the culmination and the end stage of Jew hating and of what women hating can be. But what they did before that culmination, like I said, the mindset, values, and tactics had happened before to the Jews and had happened to women. She cites a lot of other groups as well, gypsies, who've been on the receiving end of that kind of persecution, and it's all still happening to women, the way it always has, as well as in new variations. We find ourselves, as we all know, in a particularly vicious woman-hating era, with lots of new formulations, trans, and a whole bunch of other things. The first chapter is called Homeland and Home, and she talks about the derivation of the word home and what it meant. But the thing is that after Hitler's war, she says the Jewish survivors had no place to call home. And we heard in the second, in a recent webinar about Simone de Beauvoir and the second sex, talking about how the world is man's country and women don't have a country of their own. They don't have a place of their own. The Jews had no place. Women have never had a place. Jewish statelessness gave way to Zionism, the movement towards Zionism, and women's statelessness has only ever given way to home and being women in the home. Home, and she says, home may be the equivalent of a women's prison. Women may be locked inside or not permitted egress or be too injured to be able to leave. Women may be tortured or burned alive there. Women may be menial, brutalized servants, legal chattel, sexual chattel, reproductive chattel, and remain largely completely anonymous in the histories that are written. Homes are confining places to women, even Jewish homes. There are the value of girls in the home. Girls are told very, very early on that they have a lower value in the home. Which is their only native place. She talks about female infanticide having been documented among peoples as diverse as the Eskimos of the Canadian Arctic and the hunter-gatherers of the Australian bush. She talks about the South Sea island of Tikopia, India, rural China. And I mention this now because throughout the entire book, she will use illustrations from all over the world, from places in time 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and now, of what was the now for her in the year 2000. That occurs all the way throughout the book. So when you read the book, have two thoughts in your mind, because if you don't, Andrea will put them there, that this is what happens. This is when Jews are oppressed, this is what their oppressors do. This is what their haters do all the time. This is what they do. When women are oppressed, our oppressors are men, and this is what they do. All of them. Yes, all men are like that. Yes, all Jew haters are like that. And don't just look at how things wind up. Look at how they started. It didn't start with concentration camps. It started with the equivalent of crazy people in black masks. It started with the Black Panthers. Lierre, do you want to jump in here and give your initial thoughts about the book and an introduction or the beginning of what you're going to talk about?
Andrea was somebody who was, self-described. She was a lapsed pacifist, that she very, very strongly throughout her life really believed in the power of nonviolence. And she herself had been so victimized so many times by men that she found it violence abhorrent. And yet, and she believed in Israel because she was Jewish, and she had been told her whole life that, this was a good thing and that she should support it. There's this whole essay she wrote about giving every week making a little donation to plant trees in Israel when she was a kid, and that this was, this wonderful shining utopia place. And then she went there later in life and was absolutely horrified because the condition for women there was appalling, and the battered women were stuck in a completely hellish existence where they couldn't get out of these marriages, and they had no legal rights because the women had been handed over to the religious courts. That all of the socialists and all of the anarchists and all the sort of lefty people who were there at the big founding of Israel and the kibbutzim, and they all had these wonderful egalitarian ideas. And then when it came time to actually create a state, women were handed over to the religious courts. So everything to do with, quote, family life was ruled by some of the worst men on the planet. And as a result, women had nothing. And then, of course, on top of that, being Andrea, she saw the real underlying horror, which was that the men in Israel were great consumers of Holocaust-themed pornography. So no matter what had happened to them, they were still going to find a way to do it one up on women. I mean, the idea that anybody would make, pornography out of the Holocaust and wank off to it was horrifying when I read about it. And I can only imagine what it would have been like to be Andrea going to Israel, trying to find this utopia and instead finding some of the worst material that's ever been created. And knowing that, the men of your tribe are the ones who are doing this. This wasn't other men. It wasn't German men doing this. This was, her men were doing this. So there's this great quote, not even from the first chapter, but from the preface, where she says, "In the 9-year course of writing this book, I have become certain of one thing, that women cannot be free of male dominance without challenging the men of one's own ethnic group and destroying their authority. This is a willed betrayal, as any assault on male dominance must be." And that was because of what she saw, that she realized that it was, yet again, that it was the men that we are supposed to love, the men who say they love us, are the ones who do these things by and large. And this is the quote about the lapsed pacifist. "I am, as a result, a lapsed pacifist. I truly abhor violence, and I believe that both nationalism and male dominance are systems that promote and produce violence. With extreme difficulty and reluctance, I have come to believe that women have to be literate in both strategic violence and the violence of self-defense. It is one thing to choose not to kill. It is quite another to be defenseless by virtue of ignorance and socialization. Women have mastered the articulation of violence in behalf of national liberation movements, including the Jewish liberation movement called Zionism, the claim of a material right to land and sovereignty in the ancient territory of Palestine. So what she's saying is that, and she makes this parallel throughout the book, in the same way that Jews have often been rendered defenseless. I mean, Jews weren't allowed to own weapons, for instance, in many parts of Europe throughout most of history. So there's you have both ignorance and socialization saying, no, you're not allowed to take up violence. It's the same for women. And she says there's this terrible moral difficulty that she's bumped up against this yet again, that she's afraid that women are going to have to learn to do that if we are actually going to defend ourselves as a people. She doesn't like that as an insight, but she has to put it on the page because it's sort of what all of this has dragged her to, is this realization. And it's a terrible spot when you have your moral agency and then your moral agony, and you're right in the middle there. So the perceived gentleness of Jewish men before the establishment of the state never suggested to anyone that men as a whole could live the way that Jewish men had lived, which is to say, without publicly committed violence. Rather, this perception encouraged group violence against Jews in pogroms and in the Holocaust. Is it the same with women? So there again, that Jewish men have been cast as quote, very feminine, as people who don't fight back, who can't fight back, who, almost genetically are incapable of fighting back. And so does that make them more vulnerable to victimization? And then really half of this book is just trying to explain how Israel ended up being so militaristic. And that's really at the core of it, is that, Jewish men being so feminized that this is a terrible insult, and of course had horrifying ramifications, in the Holocaust and in all these pogroms. And so it's really a lot of this book is an examination of that exact phenomenon. And there's also a little bit buried in here that a lot of people, I remember talking about this a lot when this book came out. There's this, it's only like a paragraph, but she talks about how, at least in the beginning, when there was a lot of the fighting between the Jews and the Arabs, that part of the militaristic culture in the Arabs that they were fighting was that rape was what the victors did. And this is male on male rape, not about the women. So that a lot of those Israeli soldiers had in fact been gang raped, and nobody talks about it. And so again, there's this very, this insult where you're quote, like turned into a woman. And that, is part of the reason that the state of Israel is so militaristic and so woman hating, is that there's this kind of trauma that's happened to the soldiers that of course is utterly unspeakable, that there's no, it's not something that's ever talked about publicly, even though this is a known fact. And she also, in that paragraph, she makes this point that and yet the soldiers are never going to stand with women. They're never going to identify with the raped. That's just not a thing that men ever do, or very rarely do. And so we're still up against this as women, that these men, no matter what happens to them, they're going to hate us no matter what. And that's just the terrible insight into patriarchy. And as Marian said, I mean, this book is so dense with history. It's absolutely just global in scope. The amount of rape you're going to bump up against when you read this book, it can be very traumatizing. So, it's not a light read. Andrea is never a light read. But it's just culture after culture, even if she just touches on it briefly. These are the things that patriarchal men do to women. And there's a way that it's very, very hard to come to terms with that. And then at the same time, you're sort of left in that free fall of, well, what then? If this is what we're up against around the world, what then? Because, we're our loyalty, and I'm not saying me particularly, but women, our loyalty as women is always to the men of our tribe. And her point is, yeah, but it's the men of our tribe who do these things overwhelmingly to us. So then what hope do we have as women? What are we supposed to do? So she throws out these little things like, well, maybe we need to learn strategic violence. Maybe we need our own homeland. maybe that's what the Jews needed to feel safe finally and to get some measure of respect in the world. Is that what women have to do? Do we need a political homeland for women? And I found that idea extremely intriguing when I first read this book. It kind of obsessed me for a few years. Could women have their own country? Would that be actually a politically viable aim? Anyway, those are sort of some of my initial thoughts about this. But and there's just one more quote I wanted to throw out there too, where she says, in the end, every single successful liberation movement has betrayed women. Women either are the state or women are resubordinated. If the state were female, who and how many would it need to kill? And who and how many would it need to save? And I just find that very, very compelling and very heartbreaking and very serious. So, but that's really her point. Even when women have learned to take up violence, it's always in defense of the male tribe and the male state. And then the moment that that liberation is won, women are, of course, pushed back down because it's never liberation for women. It's always liberation for men.
Yeah, she goes on. She talks about the Nazis having destroyed European and East European communities of Orthodox practice through genocide and assimilationist strategies of Jews. And Germany was considered a very civilized place for Jews to live. We think of Germany at the end. Germany was considered a very educated place. It was considered a very cultured place. People were horrified that this sort of thing could happen in Germany, of all places. That's where the intellectuals were. So that the anti-Semitism was claimed to be scientific. Hatred of Jews had to be buttressed by principles that resembled science. And it's, and you have to keep making the connection because that's what the whole book is about. So by the end, you hopefully will make the connection that that's the way it is with women as well. Buttressing hatred of women and oppression of women by ostensibly scientific principles. You can start with Freud. You can start with the whole concept of women being, genetically inferior, that we're not logical, and it all, the other thing is that it all gets sexualized as well. And she says that the key to potency and the staggering half-life of anti-Semitism is in its irrationality. Despite efforts to make it scientific and intellectually substantive, it was inherently paranoid, persecution anxiety, fouling perception that lived in the mind's shadows, dynamic, sadistic, envious, characterized by greed and sexualized fear. And there is a chapter about pogroms, likening them to rape. Pogroms were just state-sanctioned, or at least state-supported, just massive attacks on Jews and Jewish settlements, Jewish towns. Even the Cossacks, she says, these wild men on horses were basically instruments of the Tsar. And in fact, pogroms became state policy and were just a warm-up for the Holocaust. So there is, and when you read this, you think, and I remember learning the history and thinking, why didn't they fight back? I mean, why didn't all these pogroms? They didn't start, they started in the 19th century, and you can't help but think, why don't they fight back? Why didn't they fight back? Why didn't they fight back? The connection to make is when this is all happening to women, when it's happening to us now, why don't we fight back? And why don't we fight back in a way that will actually render the enemy harmless, which may mean violence. But there is a difference between the violence of slave owners who terrorize and brutalize slaves, and the kind of violence of people who run a POW camp and brutalize and savage the prisoners of war. There's a difference between that violence and a slave rebellion. A slave rebellion is just to escape. It's to liberate oneself from slavery. When prisoners of war escape a prison camp, they're escaping. They're liberating themselves, and it's a different thing. And you can see it. It may be very uncomfortable. And Andrea, if she's anything, is all about making you feel uncomfortable when you think about things. Is when you see the Jews having been persecuted, century after century, millennium after millennium, you can't help but think it's like, why did they fight back? Why didn't they fight back? Why didn't they fight back? When you see women, when we see ourselves, why don't we fight back? And that's, that's what she wants you to think about. And that's in what Lierre just quoted. The unimaginable, the stuff that's really unimaginable, just doesn't emerge fully formed. So to think, well, they wouldn't do that is the same as women thinking, well, he wouldn't do that, both on an individual basis and on a societal basis.
Yeah, and there's a certain amount of I don't like Judith. I mean, she quotes Judith Herman in here too, so she's well aware of this. But what happens to people under conditions of captivity, which of course would be both the Jews in hostile Europe and women in the home and women everywhere under patriarchy. So there's that kind of learned helplessness and, what subordination does to people. So, I mean, it's with all sympathy that we say these things, but, there does come that moment where like, is somebody going to break through this on behalf of women? Are we ever going to do this? And then what would it look like if we took that seriously? And that's, I think, the reason that I love this book so much is that that's the sort of moral question that she's trying to deal with in this book. And she doesn't come to any particularly pointed conclusions, but she is a lapsed pacifist by her own declaration. And in her life, it came to this absolute cliff of just, what else are we going to do? It's just rape after rape after rape after there. When are women actually going to take this seriously as a class, not just as individuals? I mean, we can escape as individuals potentially sometimes, but what then? And that's, and the Jews as a class decided, we're going to get to Israel and we'll defend ourselves there. And she still supported Israel to the end. I mean, it was like, yes, the Jews need this unsafe place in the world, but what is the parallel for women then? Do we get our own homeland, and where would it be? And how would we make that happen? There's this great quote from her where she said, there is no north for women, meaning that in the American South during slavery times, you could escape north. You could cross that boundary and be in a territory where you could be free as a Black person. There is no north for women. There's nowhere you can go. There's no Mason-Dixon line where once you cross it, thank God it's over. That doesn't exist. It's everywhere around the planet. So these are sort of grim insight that she's got, and we're still left with that question: what now?
Someone made a comment in the chat about, if we fight back, we can get eliminated, we can get killed. Yeah, we can, but we're going to anyway. We're going to anyway. I just as a personal aside, I was in the military, and I was tiny. 5'2", barely 100 pounds, and I'm taking self-defense from this guy who'd been an Army Ranger. And so I get up on we're out on this field, and he's going to teach me some self-defense moves. And I get up and I try to, and he just knocks me over, pushes me to the ground. And I got up, and he did it a few times. He kept doing it when I would try to, and I said, Sergeant, I don't understand. He said, you can't defend yourself. I said, then why am I here? And he said, you're what, 5'2", 100 pounds, nothing, soaking wet. You can't defend yourself. You will have 2 seconds to kill someone, maybe 3 seconds. You're smart. I will teach you how to kill somebody, but unless you can get into the mindset that to defend yourself, you're going to have to kill someone, you can't defend yourself. And I'm not advocating running out on the streets, killing the first men you see by any means, but to illustrate something that connects with what I said before, what we'd said before about slave rebellion or prisoners of war is if you are going to defend yourself, if women as a class are going to defend ourselves, it will have to change what men are capable of doing to us, and there will be risk to us, but there is no other way, and it will have to start with not with abandoning this loyalty to men, saying that, oh gosh, we can't hurt them, the way it was for the Israels finally saying, we've had enough of this, we're going to just destroy our enemy. And again, I'm not saying we should go out with assault rifles or anything like that, but there is going to have to be, it can't just be, oh, well, we'll educate our sons. Oh, well, we'll, we'll try to, see if we can change men. That's not going to work. The whole book is about that it doesn't work. It didn't work for the Jews and it doesn't work for women.
Well, we need a political response of some kind. It can't just be an individual response. It has to be a political response.
Yeah.
And so what would be what would that look like? What would that be? What could women do? And are we prepared to do it? And I just, it's always that cliff again that you come to. And sometimes I think, well, if there were enough women to do it using more militant tactics, we'd probably have enough to do it using nonviolence. But maybe that's not true. I don't know. But sometimes I come to that position as well. It's like, well, if we had organized nonviolence, then perhaps, there'd be enough to do it that way. But I don't know. The thing about patriarchy is that it's not organized in the way that other systems of power are organized. It's very different because, asymmetric warfare is usually what people are stuck with when they don't have access to things like money or a military. So you organize to do that instead. And, these principles have been chalked out for, well, centuries really, but, you can learn how to fight asymmetric warfare, and it is what people do when they don't have a lot of resources to fight. And you're going after, whoever the enemy is, you're going after the kinds of choke points that you have access to. So bridges and rail lines and, electric grids and all of that kind of stuff. These are manuals you can read how to do this. And this is what successful sort of whatever guerrilla, movements, whether we agree with them or not, it's the same. These are the tactics that one might use. We can't do that. And that's not how patriarchy is organized. There isn't a supply chain. We can't go after their community headquarters. They don't have one. It's every man in every home. So we're at a total disadvantage here. We can't take up the kinds of things that these other groups have done, sometimes quite successfully. After I read this book, I actually went and I read a whole bunch of histories of the founding of Israel, and it was absolutely fascinating because I didn't know any of it before. But I wanted to know, well, all right, how did they do this? Could women do it? If they were able to found a homeland, like what went into that and what could we learn about it and apply it to women? And one of the things that was really interesting was like the first decade or two, they got absolutely nowhere because they didn't know what they were doing. So it was, these very visionary, young people mostly who founded kibbutzim and had, very lofty ideas about socialism and stuff. And I mean, I'm always fascinated by those utopian experiments. So that was fun. But they said, it was like point blank in a lot of these histories, they got nowhere until they had military training. And the way they got that was World War I. And some of them very specifically signed up for British officer training and went and fought for the British because they wanted to learn how to do it. And they became officers, and then they went back to the beginning of Israel, which was still Palestine at that point. And that was when they got somewhere, was because they finally understood how to fight this war, this battle, to claim this land. Now I'm not even getting into like whether it was okay for them to take land from the Palestinians whose land. I know that this is very contentious. That's not what we're here to talk about. That's a fine thing to talk about. It's not what we're talking about. My point is they learned how to fight with military. They got into that mindset. They understood how to do it. And that was when they actually made progress. And that just, again, makes you wonder, well, what about women? Is this something women could do? Could we learn how to do this? Could we take on that mindset? You have to learn to think in terms of hierarchy. That's what militaries, it's the only way they operate. So are women naturally opposed to that? Is there something about being female where we are not as inclined to that as men are? I mean, I don't know where the biology begins and ends there. Sometimes I'm not sure, about it. Like she has this great quote here about woman hate is a radical antagonism to existence itself. Like it or not, some women and not some men give birth. Like it or not, the egg, not the sperm, is precious, each egg a potential life. There is no extravagant surplus of eggs. And so she goes on to say, like, what does it mean to be life itself? And how much does this affect our psychology, whether or not we are biologically inclined to be kinder and nicer and more nurturing? There's still the intellectual realization that we are the people who give birth. And that has a profound impact on girls growing up. I know it did on me. And I could see very much that boys were never going to have that there was this whole sort of philosophical reckoning that I had with the cosmos about being the person who could give birth potentially, that was very different. The boys never had to think about that. I just remember feeling like, wow, I have to grow up. You know, I was 10, 11, 12. It was like, this is huge. And I was very, I resented the boys that they weren't going to have to do that this
Yeah.
was going to be very serious for me and it would never be for them. Anyway, I'm kind of wandering. Marian, you say something
No,
else.
no. I mean, this is really good stuff. You know, and she talks about it. There's a the chapters are like they have like just this slash thing. I mean, there's a chapter on you know, homeland, home, Jew hate, woman hate,
Masculinity,
pogrom,
femininity.
rape, and she has one on the state slash the family.
The family, yeah.
You know, politically, she asks, you know, how do you distinguish a nation from the state? You know, are they ever the same? Have they ever been the same? Can they ever be the same? And for Israel, they are truly one and the same. But in families, they are one and the same. And she talks about, she says, for women, the family is the equivalent of the state. All power and authority traditionally reside in the head of the family, who is male, and religion, law, culture, art, and money delineate and reinforce his sovereignty over women and children. And you're right, they have no supply chain. Again, think about a prisoner of war camp. You don't need a supply chain. The entire thing is like, you know, is a self-contained unit of oppression. North Korea, I mean, you know, they have no supply chain. They're all starving, but it's a self-contained unit of oppression. And there's a question, you know, there was a comment there, you know, how could mothers not prioritize their sons over, you know, over women, over anyone else? And this is something that you know, again, growing up, boys didn't have to deal with. They'll always believe any other male, always believe any other, but we can choose not to. If the rebellion, even if it's not violent, can be as simple as if a girl, a woman accuses your son of rape, believe her. Just believe her. You know, just believe her. If all other things being equal, believe women and prioritize women, which is, you know, which is part of the abandoning of men. There was another comment in there about, I think from Sheila, about, where is it? Oh gosh, about feminists who abandon their sons. I'm not sure any woman can do that. I mean, you get attached to a child. I'm not sure any woman can do that, but it's you can't even discuss, or it becomes anathema to even discuss if you are able to not continue a male pregnancy, to not continue the male pregnancy. We can't talk about that. That is so horrifying. But we're going to need to talk about that. And we're going to need to talk about a lot of things that are really, really uncomfortable. If you can't somehow end a male pregnancy, maybe no pregnancies. There are things we can do short of actual violence. And I'm not saying that actual violence might not be necessary, but there are things we can do that do not continue to prioritize men. And that's like, you know, the slaves in the slave camp prioritizing the slave owners. That's like the POWs in the POW camp prioritizing the guards. And until we can see that through the lens that Andrea is talking about here, you know, the Jews having been oppressed for millennia, and finally recognizing, damn, we're going to fight back and we're going to have our own country. Until women can do that as the Jews, you know, we're not going to be able to see what is necessary, and not going to be able to see what we may really need to do. And the discipline you talk about, the hierarchy and the discipline you talk about is knowing that, yeah, this may be risky for me. You know, this may be very risky for me. I may need to put myself in harm's way.
And that's true whatever tactics you use. The moment that you are a threat,
Yeah.
which is the goal, yeah, you're going to be at risk. I mean, you don't take up nonviolent direct action because you think it keeps you safe. You know you're putting yourself in harm's way. So this is true regardless of what tactic anybody's going to take up. If you're a real threat to any power structure, of course you're at risk. And I think that is often quite scary to people, and it should be because it's very serious. But yeah.
There was let's see, a comment about the way the U.S. is armed, and we need to do this underground. I'm okay with guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is a very real thing.
But we're back to the same problem, is that there aren't supply lines the way that there are. If we were actually fighting, say, the state, in America, whatever, pick your state. If we were fighting that kind of a battle, we would know what to do. I mean, there's entire manuals written about how to do this. It doesn't work for male dominance because it's organized so differently. And I think this is one of the reasons that even if you get to this point of questioning, all right, well, what now? What kind of serious strategy could we have? There's just never an answer, because what you're going to go after them one by one? It's not effective.
No.
You're churning them out every day, so what then? I mean, the only supply line I can think of, honestly, is pornography. And that's great. If somebody wanted to take up, those kinds of tactics against the porn industry, I'm all for it. But that's the only one I can think of that's actually organized like that, even a little bit. The rest of it is this is always the problem for women. It's every man in every house. There's not like the central committee, that we could take out the czar. I remember once hearing Catherine McKinnon speak, and at the end she's like, there's more women in this room than it took Bolsheviks to, assassinate the czar. And we all start cheering, but it's like, we don't have a czar. There isn't one guy in charge. That's the problem. It's every little dictator, which is like, 90% of them. So what then?
Right in the middle of the book is the chapter on hate literature / pornography.
Right.
And one of the, no, we don't have a czar, but there is language, and that has been colonized as well. It was colonized by the Nazis. It's colonized by men. She starts that chapter talking about the deconstructionism and postmodernism of the philosophers Heidegger and de Man, who were members and collaborators of the Nazi Party, and supplied a lot of the philosophical underpinnings for hating the Jews, and for the kind of language that was used towards the Jews. They referred to the public as simple-minded trolls who thought that some things were true and some things were not. And which is exactly where we find ourselves now. And it even reveals itself in simple things like saying boys will be boys. It even reveals itself in just somehow feeling that there is some kind of woman's essence and that, and making that part of our language, and therefore part of our conception of how we view ourselves. And it makes us feel like, well, there's nothing we can do about it because this is the way women are. The Nazis learned that making language meaningless and incomprehensible is a means of oppression, for the Nazis over the Jews, and it's true for men over women as well. And she says that the greatest affront to language is to devalue it entirely. So that's not an overall strategy, but our strategies are going to have to be like whack-a-mole, that something happens over here, and it had to be for the Jews as well. But for us, it's even more so that if something happens over here, they need to whack it down. If something happens over there, they need to whack it down. Lierre's disappeared. So until Lierre comes back, I guess I've got the calm. There's another quote I want to read. Instead of recognizing the power of language, which is complex and difficult to untangle or understand, the notion that words have consequences is ridiculed. Does that sound familiar? Any attempt to try to understand the linguistic dimensions of hate is treated as if the effort itself were a form of fascism. But words live and have their most profound meanings in ordinary conversations and trivial conflicts. Anti-Semitic language was used to demonize Jews and who were also sexualized. She turns to American politics, and this is in 2000, so it was contemporary to her, and looks at violence from the conservative right as well, starting with the Oklahoma City bomber, Timothy McVeigh, who read a book called The Turner Diaries, which advocated right-wing revolution, including strategies, tactics, and armed scenarios. They admired the Nazis. And she said that the right wing sees the women's movement as toxic. I don't think she would be surprised that the left has gotten just as bad, if not worse, although she may have been surprised at how fast it happened. This is I'm reading the I'm reading the chat. So the whole book, and again, that's why I said that Andrea Dworkin can be very difficult to read. The book is really focused on one example after another about what happened to the Jews, and why this is meaningful and applicable to women. And unless women, as the oppressed, try or realize that we need to do what the Jews do, we won't get anywhere. And Jewish women, as Lierre mentioned before, Jewish women found that Jewish men were not their friends at all. There is the book, This Bridge Called My Back, about women of color. There is one of the essays in there that where it specifically talks about Black women, specifically in that essay, not being able to really be liberated or enjoy any kind of liberation that women can have unless they also abandon Black men. There was talk during the second wave, and it was very frequent, about abandoning men, and that meant in terms of the two things that women want from men, which is sexual services and emotional labor. When people criticize Israel now, and the Israelis, who have really gone to a lot of excesses, but the criticism is often mingled with a certain amount of admiration, especially from other men, that they give no Fs. I won't say the F word here, but that they give no Fs. So that any strategies that women bring to abandoning men will have to result in a, wow, they really give no Fs about us. And unless women face the fact that they're not on our side and they're never going to be on our side, oh, there you are, you're back, Lierre. We can't even come up with a meaningful strategy. Oh, that's all right. I'm sorry I was on. Lierre, do you have anything to add from the great beyond where you went to?
I don't know what you're even talking about now, so I'm really sorry.
Oh, that's all right.
Why don't you say a few more things and then I can jump in? I have no idea what happened. My internet just stopped working. So then it came back. So here we are. I live in a very rural area, and sometimes internet is just not really defendable. So,
and again, one of the things that she talks about is in terms of language was the value of propaganda as well. And she talks about Hitler saying that he understood propaganda from the inside out. It must be popular and accessible, easily understood by the masses, adjusted to the most limited intelligence among those it is addressed to. Even though policy was built on scientific or rational or logical anti-Semitism, propaganda must teach the emotions of a crowd. It must present love or hate, right or wrong, truth or lie, never half this way and half that way. That sounds like gaslighting when applied to a when applied to personal relationships. But you know, it is a global thing. One illustration that I like to use is that if you jump out of an airplane from 20, 25,000 feet without a parachute, you're going to die. I mean, it's just, if A, then B, you're going to die. And there are a few, you could probably count them on one hand. There are a few instances of people who actually survive, but if you jump out of a plane, you're going to die. If A, then B. It is, I mean, it's axiomatic, and you can't get out of it. If women continue to provide, if the oppressed continue to provide the oppressors, whether it's Jews or women, with everything that's demanded and needed, we will continue to be oppressed. And it's not there's no value judgments or blame on women individually, but it's a jumping out of an airplane without a parachute situation. You jump out of an airplane without a parachute, you're going to die. You rely on men to care for what happens to women as a whole. You're going to continue. We're all going to continue to be oppressed.
I always highly recommend that anyone who wants to make a movement read the work of Gene Sharp, and he was the foremost theorist on nonviolent direct action, and he was an amazing human being. But the major insight of his work is that the powerful only have power because we let them have it. That really we always have the power, we just don't realize it. And so all the ways that social movements can get people to withdraw their loyalty from the powerful and build something that is actually effective against the power structure. But that was such a key insight for me to understand that it's like, I mean, he's right. They only and there are ways they get it from us. I mean, they keep us all in a state of terror, essentially. So of course we let them do what they want. They don't even need to apply it all that often. We all get the picture. But it is the major insight of how political power works, is that we have to consent. And so that consent is manufactured, and here's how. But if we would withdraw that consent, then all things are possible. So anyway, I mean, his books are very, very dense, and he spent his life working on this, but it's well worth reading in terms of how successful movements can be built. Still, again, I don't, there's just always this gap of how does this apply to women, because the structure of male dominance is so different from everything else. And clearly part of it is that we have to break our loyalty to men, and that is obviously always the first step. But what then? Like what is the movement we're aiming for? How would we structure it? And then what are our actual goals? And those are things that we just don't ever even get to talk about, because we never think in those terms. We're always, I mean, we're doing our best just to drag the wounded off the battlefield here. So, I'm not throwing shade on any of us. I know we're working as hard as we can, but there's a big picture here that we don't ever get to talk about it. So, but that's why I love this book, is like all of that is sort of in here,
Yeah, the language that we speak to ourselves with, that creeping, well, not all men are like that, or well, my fill in, husband, boyfriend, son, brother, whatever, isn't like that, or even extending it to, well, yeah, but women do it too. That is part of the power of language that she talks about here in the middle there, that we say to ourselves, that is very, very powerful. It's like self-propagandizing, but it's because that's all we hear. That's what we hear from our oppressor. That language, oppressors, that language doesn't come from us. That comes from them. Are there any questions? Any specific questions? This is really very, very difficult stuff for a lot of women to talk about. Most women, the vast majority of women, have an attachment to men in some way, but insist that he's different. He really cares about me. That's great. If you're one of the very few people that you can count on one hand that jumps from 20,000 feet without a parachute and survives, so that you're with a man and it's absolutely wonderful. that is really good. I'm happy for you. I mean, really, I think that's great.
But you can't let that stand in the way of the political analysis.
But yeah, but
Catherine McKinnon actually had this great line. She's like, you can like your job and still hate capitalism. I mean, it's exactly like that. You know, you can have a nice man in your life. I don't care. That's great. Please have a nice man. But that doesn't stop the analysis. Like, we know men commit 99% of the sexual crime and 98% of the violent crime. We know who's doing this. That can't stop you from understanding on a global level, you know, what men have been doing for centuries to women. That's the problem. And so I think a lot of women use that as sort of a barricade to exactly the horrors that are in this book. And yet we have to come to terms with this, as hard as it is. That on a mass scale, these are the absolute atrocities that men commit on a daily level against women. And it doesn't matter whether you have a nice son.
Yeah, I mean, you
have a nice son. I hope that you can raise a feminist son. That's great. We need those men too, but that can't stand in the way of what a political analysis tells you, which is class-based. Is men are here, women are here, and these are the things they're doing to keep us there. It's not that difficult. It's emotionally hard, but it's not intellectually difficult.
Yeah, you can be in a prisoner of war camp and have a relationship with the one really truly decent guard there who's a loving man, but you're still in a prisoner of war camp, and so are all the other women around you. There was a question about Gene Sharp. Gene Sharp wrote a book called The Politics of Nonviolent Action.
Yes.
Yeah. It's 3 volumes.
Yeah.
But that's it. It's Sharp is no, there's no E at the end. I see.
Yeah, no E. But he's dead now, but he was the world. He's the one who wrote and he was responsible for more revolutions than anybody. And I include Karl Marx in that. I mean, his work was absolutely taken up and taken to heart by people around the globe and used very successfully to overthrow all kinds of regimes, and is still being used. So it's real. It just feels like required reading for anyone who's serious about liberation movements.
And somebody asked, how do you defeat an oppressor without becoming an oppressor yourself? One of the things is that it needs to be dispassionate. We think about defeating an oppressor or even fighting physically as this just really, passionate outpouring of emotion and anger. But it can really be very, very dispassionate, or what might even be perceived of as cold. When an oncologist kills cancer cells, cancer cells don't become normal cells. You kill or you get rid of, or you render harmless the cells that can kill the body, and there's no anger or passion about it. It's finding a strategy and applying it.
I mean, we did Robin Morgan, her book, The Demon Lover, a few weeks ago, and you can look at that seminar. But her book is about political violence and the fact that so many men get off on it, essentially, that there's a sexual thrill for men. So then why do women do it? And her answer in that book is, well, the women fall in love with this sort of trope of the demon lover, of the man who is the revolutionary, the radical, who has all this passion and anger and is so intense. And so women fall for him and then get dragged into these movements, more or less. And which sort of, then there's this underlying question, well, what about women who join these movements who aren't in love with, this rebel figure? What about women who do it on behalf of women? And that is not, she didn't really answer that question in that book because it wasn't what she was asking, but it's what I'm asking. And I still want an answer to that question. So, yeah. But I don't think that we should, I just want to be very clear. Like, this is very serious, and I don't want anybody engaging with this who isn't going to take it seriously. Serious political movements have very serious political ramifications, and even to consider doing harm to others is something a lot of women are just recoil from, and I completely understand that, and I value that. It's, we all come at this from different perspectives, and if your spiritual commitments are to only nonviolence, I have nothing but respect for that. It is a very life-affirming position to take, and I am only pushed past it because of my desperation. And I'll say once again, I have my moral agency and my moral agony, and I have never found a great balance between those two things. But this is not something that any of us should be discussing lightly. These are very serious considerations for any movement, and I just want all options on the table because I don't know what else to do in the face of thousands of years of rape. And I see no future in which this does not continue until the planet is dead. I would like to know what we're going to do.
Further along, when she talks about Zionism and women's liberation, kind of harks back to the beginning of the book. Nationalism divides women. Loyalty to state or country is masculine business. Loyalty to men per se is feminine business. Men of the same nationality are one's nation. Protecting them and easing their burden is one's responsibility. Loving them and loving what they do is the emotional ghetto in which women live. Nationalism and the nation itself work to make women invisible. So whatever we do, whatever tactics or strategies we use, needs to create women's country. Men's country is any country they decide to exist in. Every country they do exist in, the whole world. Women's country is whatever we do. The strategy should be to create women's country. When you hear conversations about women's land, one of the first things I always say in those conversations is that you need to create two places, one for women who really want women's land and one for women who still want the cords of attachment to be able to reel in men to a land whenever they want to. And that, that doesn't create women's country. That just creates a place where men still have sway and influence. And I think that many of us can hardly conceive of a place where men are irrelevant unless a woman in particular decides he is not irrelevant. Any other questions? Let's see. Commitment to nonviolence, women's country, consciousness. Okay. This is, I've run out of notes. Wasn't there a book based on the premise, A World Without Men? Yes, there are tons of books in feminist literature from the past. The
Wanderground, you got to read it.
The Wanderground, that's the one I've read. I haven't.
It's terrible, and it's so much fun. The writing is just ghastly, but it's so much fun. Yeah.
So, like I said, with Dworkin is easy to read because she's very straightforward and because it's just very readable. The language is just very readable, but she's very difficult to read because we're talking about, gosh, do we, raise a women's army and should we be armed and and should we include violence? I mean, she forces you, if you really want to read her books, to think about things and have conversations that women are taught thoughts women are taught we're not supposed to have, and conversations women are taught we're not supposed to have, and men would be terrified if we really started having. Yeah. Any other? Herland. People are coming up with more books.
Oh, Herland. Yeah, that was a fun one. The Gate to Women's Country. That was Sherry Tepper.
And there's a comment here, and I think it's probably a whole other discussion about getting rid of patriarchy and moving back to matriarchy. And I don't think that's what Andrea is necessarily saying, and I'm not sure that that's the answer as well. The archy part seems to imply just a reverse oppression, and I don't think that's what she's talking about. But I think that that's probably another good discussion somebody might want to have. We're about out of time. Really good to see you at this early hour and hear from you again, Lierre. Thanks everybody, 116 of us, for participating. Let's see.
I just wish we could all meet in public and talk about this.
Yeah, I know.
I wish we could have a whole week to just talk about this.
Well,
I never get to talk about it.
Let's go back in time.
Back in the old days, right? In the 80s.
When we could.
Around for hours about this. But it's been a long time.
Again, thank you everybody for being here. And we will see you next week.